Hi, I'm Sean Agnew, and thanks again for joining us this week. This week's sermon is taken from the parable of the prodigal son. Now, I know you may be thinking I've already heard all I need to hear from that parable, and you may be thinking about turning the video off right now. But there is a recent book out by Tom Keller called The Prodigal God, which looks at this story in a new light, taking a look at two types of lostness, one that we're very familiar with, and another one perhaps not as much. So today's word has a message for everybody, so we hope that you'll continue watching and enjoy today's message, The Prodigal God.
When you hear this parable, where do you tend to focus? What character do you tend to zoom in on? It's probably the younger son, right? I mean, it all seems to be about him. It's about his request of the father's response to his request, his journey to the far country, his penitent return. But all the events seem to revolve around the younger son. And so that's probably where we focus as we hear the parable once again today. But you know, another reason perhaps that we focus on him is because perhaps we can relate to him, at least in part, and we're comforted. We like the fact that this story about him is in the Bible and in the teachings of Jesus, because it lets us know if we have ever, or if we should ever wander, so to speak, then this tells us we can come home. And we come home to one who understands and who awaits with open arms. And so that's good news. We like that. But if we don't focus on the younger son, then where do we tend to focus? What character do we tend to focus on? Probably the father in the parable. Right? And the way it begins is, Jesus says, there was a man who had two sons. And certainly there is very much in the parable about his relationship, the father's relationship, with each of his sons. But as we hear it today, this being Father's Day, we might be all the more likely to focus on the father and think about how our own father was or is like that or not like that. Or if we're fathers ourselves, to appreciate again a tale about a father's love, but also to recognize in it the challenge that it can be to be that generous and that gracious to, on a consistent basis with every child every day. But if we focus on the father in the parable, it might not be readily obvious how he is in any way himself prodigal. And the father in the parable represents God. And so when you see the message title today, The Prodigal God, and you're looking at the father who represents God in the parable, you might say, how is he, the father, or how is he, God, in any way prodigal? Well, the title of the message comes from a book by that very title, The Prodigal God, by Timothy Keller. We did a study of it in the last gift session. But in the book, the author points out that actually the word prodigal means recklessly extravagant, having spent everything. And knowing that definition, perhaps we can see how it is that the father in the parable was so extravagant and spent everything. But also, I think we want to appreciate how it is that God has been extravagant and has spent or given everything for all of His children. That includes us, and most powerfully and profoundly through the Son that He sent, the one who told the parable, Jesus. But to get a better appreciation of how God has been so extravagant and generous for all of His children, maybe it would be helpful if we got more out of the parable. And maybe that is helped if we start off by looking at who Jesus told the parable to. It says at the beginning of Luke chapter 15, there were two groups of people coming around Jesus. One is the tax collectors and sinners. That's the first group. The second group are the Pharisees and the scribes. The first group, the tax collectors and the sinners, are the not religious people. The second group, the Pharisees and the scribes, are the very religious people. When the very religious people come around, they have this accusation they bring against Jesus that He's getting a little bit too chummy with the first group of people, the not religious people, the tax collectors and sinners. And they don't like that. And so in response to that accusation, Jesus told this parable. So He told it primarily to the very religious people, the Pharisees and the scribes, but still it looks like, as you read it, the first group of people, the tax collectors and the sinners, the not religious people, are within earshot as well. Which is to say, there was something in the parable for all of them, which is to say, there's something in the parable for all of us. But let's look at not only who He told the parable to, but why He told it to them. In response to this accusation, you're getting a little bit too chummy with the not religious people. He told 3 parables, actually. This is the third of the 3. But every one of the parables had something to do with lostness. He told 3 parables about lostness because the people he was talking primarily to, the very religious, the Pharisees and the scribes, would recognize lostness. But they would especially recognize one particular form of lostness, which is seen in the younger brother in the parable, who represents, of course, the not religious people, the tax collectors and sinners. The very religious people, the Pharisees and the scribes, recognized very easily and right away that kind of lostness, the rebelliousness, the rowdiness, the immorality, the indulgent lifestyle, the impulsiveness. But Jesus told the parable to bring out and help them see and recognize another kind, a second kind of lostness that is seen in the elder brother in the parable, who represents these very religious people, the Pharisees and the scribes. Jesus wanted them to recognize this second kind of lostness, and not only that, to recognize it in themselves. Now, when we direct our attention and our focus to the elder brother in the parable, we might say, what could possibly be wrong with Mr. Right? Because that's who he seems to be, right? The good son. But you see, the elder brother, or the elder son, he is also alienated from the father. There is a fracture in their relationship, and it's not caused by the return of the younger son. It's exposed by the return of the younger son. It already existed that way. But you see this fracture in this relationship between the elder son and the father in this disrespect that the elder son had for the father, which borders on contempt. And you hear it in the words that he uses, in the attitude that he brings, and the word that he chooses. You see it in his refusal to go in to the celebration. This disrespect. Because the thing is, if I had to sum it up succinctly to begin, is the elder son doesn't really care about the father. He doesn't care how any of this is affecting the father. He cares about the property that should be coming his way, because you heard him say it, he's earned it. He deserves it. He has rights. So if we're going to look at and try to also, along with the first hearers of this second kind of lostness, as is seen in the elder brother, it might help us to dig into it to see that he was angry. That's what it said. He was angry. Because if you have this elder brother spirit, you do what you do to get the payoff, to get the reward. You do what you do to get the leverage and what is coming your way because you've earned it and you've discerned it. And so if it's not coming your way and you feel that God owes you these things because you deserve them, you've got rights, then if those things are not forthcoming, then you don't just get angry. You don't just get disappointed, you get angry. Because elder brothers do what they do for the rewards. They obey for the rewards. So if the rewards aren't forthcoming, if life is not going like it should, then you're not just sorrowful, you're mad, even bitter. Because the underlying belief is if you live a good life, you should get a good life. So how dare God withhold it from you? Or worse yet, give it to somebody else who is obviously less deserving. But the thing about this parable and how Jesus is wanting the very religious to recognize this second kind of lostness, it really is coming to light when we see that he's trying to get them to recognize in themselves, I guess you'd have to call it a self-salvation project. It's pride. It's their self-righteousness. Because they would have said to God what the elder brother would say to the father, I lived this life of drudgery. Did you hear him say, I've worked like a slave? I lived this life of drudgery all these years doing things I didn't really want to do. And I don't think you appreciate the spotless moral record I've accumulated in the process. I obeyed you not because I care about you, but because I care about your things, and you owe them to me. You know, when it all comes down, if we have that elder brother spirit of what God owes us because we've earned it and we deserved it, then we really do have to ask, then who is Jesus? I mean, he might be our teacher and he might be our inspiration, but he's not our Savior. Because we've put ourselves and our good moral record into that position. So then who is Jesus? I hope that you see that the father in the parable was wounded by both of his sons. But I hope that you also notice that the father in the parable representing God went out to both of them to invite and to welcome them in. Which is to say that no matter which kind of lostness any one of us would most recognize in ourselves today, the main thing is to recognize ourselves as being like everybody else, sinner, saved by grace. The feast of the Father is especially good when contrasted with the bitter taste that we younger brother types have known in the far country, but it is also especially good when contrasted with the bitter spirit that we elder brother types have carried around inside of us for just a bit too long. God is good, and it's just good to be his child and to be a part of the family. Wouldn't you say?
As you heard this very familiar parable again today, the parable of the prodigal son, and heard us speak to the story of the elder brother as well as the younger, very central to it all is, of course, the role of the father who represents God. On this Father's Day in which we shared this message, I hope that you got the message that truly no matter what your father was like, and no matter what your upbringing was like, and no matter what your experience has been, and no matter which side of righteousness you've been on the majority of the time, either the seeming lack of it or a self-righteousness and a pride in your moral record, I hope that you hear once again today the good news that you have a God, a Father who has been prodigal in that, as is the real definition of the word, has been extravagant, has given, has spent everything, lavishly poured out himself and every blessing. And in response to that amazing grace, that you would hear today the invitation to come to the feast of the Father and to truly be a part of the celebration and the joy of his family.